The topic that I chose to talk about and how neurological contributors affect violent criminals is childhood abuse and how that's going to transfer to adulthood. So basically in court cases we see that a majority of the children who were abused are 5 or under. So this is directly correlational to our brain developing. So our brain is very vulnerable to what it's exposed to during this time, and it could be flawed by what you're exposed to. So we see in studies that violent adults were violent or aggressive as children, and this is seen as a neurological response to abuse during their development. So in studies, we see that violent people perform more poorly than controls in neurocognitive testing. So this is going to show that in the prefrontal cortex, you can have deficits as a result from genetics or even from physical injury or disease, and this shows that damage or dysfunction to this frontal cortex may cause a person to be unable to handle the strong violent impulses that are actually present during abuse. So this neurocognitive testing also shows that children and adults that are prone to violence also have an underreactive fear conditioning system, which directly correlates to their violence. So what fear conditioning is the autonomic responses that are associated with fight or flight. And fight or flight is basically a person's response to whether they're going to take action to a situation or walk away from it. So if you have damage to this area, it's going to flaw your decision making. Also, there's times when someone can be cognitively aware that what they're doing is irrational, but they're inhibited physically from acting on the knowledge because of the lack of somatic markers in the brain. So somatic markers are what our body produces to help influence decisions about dangerousness. So in our brain we see that everything is a process based on communication between the different regions of our brain. So if we have flaws to any of these brain regions, it could leave discrepancies in our brain processing, which can inhibit or activate a certain response that could be directly related to violence. So also, we see stress as a contributing factor in neurology. In our brain, we release stress hormone called cortisol. So any change in regulation of cortisol could have a negative response in our brain. So if you have too much cortisol, it could alter your mood toward a manic or psychotic state, which is greatly related to violence. So my personal opinion on neurological factors contributing to violent behaviors, I think it's very relevant, and I think it's very concrete in justifying someone's violent behavior. We see in nature versus nurture that your DNA mixed with your environment and your experience together make a person the way they are. So we see in children 5 and under that violence and abuse at home can actually change the way their brain develops, which could negatively affect them in adulthood, and they have no way to have any defense against that. Basically, their household is negatively affecting the way their brain develops. So I thought the Bobby Jalong case was a good example of genetic factors as well as environmental factors in a violent person. So basically, Bobby Jalong, he had an extra X chromosome, so he had too much estrogen being released, which led to gender identity disorder. His mother also would sleep in the same room with him, in the same bed actually, in a 1-bedroom apartment, and she would have men over all the time. Bobby Jalong also had a lot of physical accidents, motorcycle crashes, falling off swings, losing teeth, hitting his head, things like this. So later in life, when he got married, he found that he had sexual frustration problems. Trying to fix this would start with masturbation, and this is even when his arm was in a cast after his motorcycle accident. Also, sex with his wife 2 times a day was not enough anymore. So what Bobby did is he went out, he'd use bondage and knives, which are very violent tools, to rape and kill women. So this basically shows an example of a real-life case where someone's genetic predisposition basically leaves you vulnerable to being a violent person later in life, a violent criminal even. So I just believe that for people who are committing these disgustingly violent crimes, even like the Jack the Ripper case that we see in class, a lot of times if you take the time to look into their neurological conditions, you'll see problems in this. So I think that neurologically, if we see children in younger ages with these types of problems, we should try to do something to help this so that maybe later in life they won't turn down to a violent pathway.